Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bowery, The Strange History of New York's Oldest Street, by Stephen Paul Devillo. Narrated by Daniel Henning. Preface. The Bowery isn't what it used to be, and in fact, it never was. New York City's oldest thoroughfare, the Bowery, has both reflected and shaped the ever-changing city it helped give birth to. Throughout its long, lively, and sometimes tragic history, the Bowery has hosted an endless parade of farmers, drovers, soldiers, coppers, gangsters, statesmen, showmen, magicians, poets, writers, artists, and unfortunates. Fur traders gave way to farmers, whose farms in turn gave way to taverns, tanneries, saloons, circuses, dime museums, tattoo parlors, speakeasies, flophouses, brothels, and religious missions. The Bowery's cavalcade continues today as this long-avoided boulevard experiences a dramatic rebirth. Well-dressed visitors now head to the Bowery, not as a place to go slumming, but as a world-class destination for contemporary art and music. It's been an astonishing 400-year-long story that I would like to share with you. A lifelong New Yorker, I've long been fascinated with the city's lesser-known nooks and byways, the small places that often contain a larger history. Venturing down the Bowery, just as it was re-emerging into the daylight in the 1990s, I wondered what tales its old buildings could tell me, and found there are many such tales to tell. Come with me as we take a walk through time, as we stroll down the once infamous Bowery. 1. The Great Bowery. Like many later visitors to New York, the first European settlers made their way to the Bowery. Coming from the Netherlands, they sought not thrills, but furs and farms. It wasn't yet called the Bowery back then, but it was already an old thoroughfare. From the Harlem River crossing at the far northern end of the island, a Native American trail ran down the east side of Manhattan to an area just south of a large pond. From there, a short trail led to a village on Werpo Hill on the west side of the pond. Another trail branched east to the small village of Nektonk, where Corlear's Hook jutted into the bend of the East River, while the main trail continued on to the canoe landing at the far southern tip of the island, where Castle Clinton stands today. Running the length of the island, the trail connected different groups of the Lenni Lenape, or Delaware Nation. The Canarsie, or Werpos, occupied the southern part of the island, while the Rechkawauwonk occupied the north end, and the trail that was to become the Bowery served then, as it would later, as a connection and meeting ground among different groups. Apart from linking the bands living on the island, the trail served trading parties from the mainland to the north and east, and a branch led to Sappoconacon on the island's western shore, where Indians from west of the river would paddle over to trade deer and elk meat for tobacco at a place that would become the meatpacking district. The Bowery's reputation as a place of sharp dealings may well have begun with Peter Minuit's legendary $24 land deal. Minuit, the director of the new Netherland colony, is credited with swapping 60 Dutch guilders worth of European goods for the whole of Manhattan Island. However, the precise location and circumstances of this transaction are uncertain. Whether it happened at Shorekapcock, near present-day Spuyten Duyvil, or if, as was more likely, it took place at Werpo Hill by the Collect Pond, the fact was that no single group possessed the entire island. The Canarsie people at Werpo Hill had rights only to the southern end of the island. The rest was occupied by other Lenape groups, not least of which were the Rechkawauwonk at the northern end, who would sell their territory only in pieces. The last of the Rechkawawonk wouldn't leave Manhattan until 1715, over 90 years after Peter Minuit's legendary purchase of the island. Like the thousands of commuters who today follow old Indian routes to the island, the Dutch came to Manhattan for business. The southern tip of the island faced one of the finest harbors in North America, from which ships could sail across the Atlantic to markets in Europe or outfit privateers for a bash at the Spanish Main. Manhattan, moreover, lay alongside the great waterway that the Dutch knew as the North, later Hudson, River, which, like the trail, pointed north toward the sources of beaver furs. Dutch fur traders had been on Manhattan for over 10 years before the West India Company planted a permanent settlement there in 1624. New Amsterdam served as a trading post and overseas shipping point for furs sent down from Fort Orange, site of present-day Albany. With the Eurasian beaver long hunted out, American beaver furs were a valuable commodity, prized for making felt for the big, wide-brimmed hats that in those days defined gentlemen of fashion. The Dutch West India Company was sure that New Amsterdam would prove to be a gold mine. But it needed a stable foundation, and that meant settlers who could create an agricultural base to provide a reliable food source. The Dutch accordingly laid out 6 farms, or bouweries, in Dutch, along the trail north of New Amsterdam, 5 small farms plus the Great Bowery, which will figure in the story later. These 6 bouweries were named after their owners: Blijveld, Schoot, Wolfert, Van Corlear, Leendert, Pannepacker. The Indian Trail linked the farms together, so it became known as the Bowery Lane. Almost immediately, however, the process began of chopping the Bowery down from its original 13-mile length to its current stretch of only 2 miles. The Dutch gave the southern end of the trail the grandiose name of Herenstraat, Broadway, which ran up to present-day Ann Street. There, the trail became the Hereweg Highway, following the line of today's Park Row, becoming Bowery Lane only once it was past today's Chatham Square. Foreshadowing its history, the trail became the scene of New York's first mugging shortly after the establishment of New Amsterdam. A Lenape came down the trail with his young nephew, bearing a load of furs for trade to the Dutch. As the pair approached the pond, they were jumped by 3 men, who murdered the Lenape and made off with the furs. Not wanting to deal further with the Europeans, the boy didn't try to report the murder, but simply made his way back home, determined to someday settle accounts. New Amsterdam grew into a small town, and soon began to take on many of the characteristics of its mega-city successor. The Netherlands did not have a large surplus population to export to its colony, so the West India Company offered generous terms to recruit potential settlers from other parts of Europe. Those who accepted the offer, many of them French-speaking Walloons from today's Belgium, received free transportation to New Amsterdam, plus a house, barn, and tools. The company also loaned each settler a starter kit of livestock, including 4 each of horses, cows, sheep, and pigs. As time went on, more generous land grants would be made to individuals who would recruit and outfit their own settlers to live on the land as rent-paying tenants. Among them was Jonas Bronk, who would establish in 1639 his estate in what became his namesake borough, the Bronx. Recruiting settlers from among various refugee groups in Holland made New Amsterdam the cosmopolitan city New York remains today. In 1643, the Jesuit father Isaac Jogues, escaping from captivity and torture among the Mohawks, passed through New Amsterdam. The Catholic priest was warmly received by the Dutch Calvinist director Kieft, who, like many a later New Yorker, insisted on giving the out-of-towner a grand tour. Jogues found New Amsterdam to be a place where no less than 18 languages were spoken and where several Protestant denominations practiced, even though Dutch Calvinism was the official religion of the colony. But amid its cultural diversity, New Amsterdam experienced ethnic conflict. Dutch and English interests clashed in Connecticut, where rival settlers from New Netherlands and New England stalked out conflicting claims. By 1640, English settlers from Connecticut were moving into Long Island, changing the ethnic composition of such towns as Flushing and establishing their own settlements in Hempstead and Gravesend. The old cliché, "there goes the neighborhood," may well have been first muttered in Dutch regarding incoming Anglo-Saxons. Still, New Amsterdam continued on its easygoing way, sometimes to the consternation of its ministers, called dominees. People taking Sunday off for secular pleasures especially annoyed them. The Reverend Johannes Bowery complained in his reports back home that the colonists were very ignorant in true religion and very much given to drink. Bowery's own predecessor, Everardus Bogardus, was himself known to imbibe a bit of Dutch courage before mounting the pulpit to deliver boozy diatribes attacking the sixth director of the colony, Willem Kieft. For his part, Kieft would post a drummer outside the church door to drown out the dominie. The congregation learned little true religion, but it was great entertainment. With its diverse, rowdy, and hard-drinking population, New Amsterdam saw a lot of conflict, some of which was settled in court. Suits often involved the depredations of unfenced animals and verbal abuse between neighbors, while merchants and storekeepers complained against street peddlers, a contention that remains as heated at the beginning of the 21st century as it was in the 17th. Other pleasures were avidly pursued. Nocturnal liaisons took place at a watercourse nicknamed Horenkill, Hore Creek, outside the town limits. The precise location of this colonial landmark is uncertain, but it might have been the brook called the Fersk Water Killetje, Little Fresh Water, later Old Wreck Brook, that flowed out of the Collect Pond, crossing the Bowery where the Kissing Bridge was later located. If so, it was a portent of the Bowery's future. Amid the good times, though, resentments festered among the Native Americans. By the 1640s, tensions between Europeans and Native Americans were growing in New Netherlands, partly because of the sharp dealings the Indians received from the Swanikens, salty people, as they called the Dutch. Resentments were brought to a head by Director Kieft's arrogant demand that the Native Americans, still resident on Manhattan, pay taxes to the Dutch. Meanwhile, the Native American boy who saw his uncle killed in 1626 for furs had grown to manhood, bearing an obligation to avenge the death. In 1641, he decided the time had come for retribution, and the warrior came down the old trail and went to the isolated cabin of Klaas Smits by Turtle Bay. He killed Smits and went home again, satisfied that the blood debt occasioned by the European murder of his uncle was satisfied, in the time-honored way, by the murder of another European. To Director Kieft, it was a wanton homicide, with an alleged 20-year-old crime serving as a flimsy excuse, and he demanded that the natives surrender the murderer. The natives explained that this was merely the traditional expiation of a crime and felt no obligation to cooperate with Dutch justice. Unable to obtain satisfaction from the native Lenape, the Smits murder became a pretext for Kieft's War, which began with massacres of Native Americans on Corlear's Hook and Pavonia, present-day Jersey City, in 1643. The conflict lasted until 1645, and did not go well for the Dutch, rolling back the frontier of New Netherlands down the Bowery right up to the streets of New Amsterdam. As the isolated farmhouses on Manhattan were one by one set ablaze, Kieft tried to pass the buck and place the blame on his officers, one of whom tried to assassinate him. The Bowery Lane reverted to being a route for Native American war parties, and it was simply too dangerous for farmers to bed down beyond New Amsterdam's wooden palisades. The war eventually sputtered out in mutual exhaustion, but the West India Company had nearly lost New Netherlands. It was decided that Kieft would have to go, and a more effective administrator put in his place. Into this war-ravaged colony, Peter Stuyvesant came on May 11, 1647, like an avenging high school principal. Still in his late 30s, Stuyvesant had forged an interesting career with the West India Company, working his way up from clerk after his premature departure from university. His trademark wooden leg that stumped down the gangplank that May day was a souvenir of his brief term as director of the Dutch colony on Curaçao, where he led an expedition to capture the island of St. Martin back from the Spanish, who had themselves captured it from the Dutch a few years before. A cannonball shot from the Spanish fort mangled his leg, and he was forced to abandon the expedition, characteristically blaming the debacle on the unwilling dogs that it was his misfortune to command. As Kieft's war sputtered to a close, Peter recuperated from his amputation in Holland, where he married Judith Bayard and sought reassignment with the company. Stuyvesant found New Amsterdam run down and demoralized, and he set about restoring discipline with an energy that made him the first of Manhattan's reform mayors. He proclaimed the town's first Sunday blue law, ordering the taverns closed on the Sabbath and at 9 p.m. on weeknights, an issue that would still reverberate on the Bowery 250 years later. He enacted stiff penalties for anyone drawing a knife in an argument and stiffer penalties for anyone using one. He laid down laws on building standards, the fencing in of animals, and fire control, and slapped an excise tax on imported wine and liquor. He topped all this off with the town's first traffic ordinance, which forced wagon drivers to lead their horses by hand through the streets of New Amsterdam, except along Broadway. The strong-willed Stuyvesant was unapologetic about his autocratic rule. Anyone who had survived having a leg sawed off without anesthesia was unlikely to be frightened by protesting burghers. He once told objecting New Amsterdammers that he intended to go on issuing whatever orders he saw fit, especially those which tend to the glory of God, the best interest of the inhabitants, and will prevent more sins, scandals, debaucheries, and crimes. New Amsterdam's residents continued to produce scandals and debaucheries, but Stuyvesant's rule did make New Amsterdam look like a civilized place again. 4 years after his arrival, the Director General decided to settle down there for good. He built White Hall, at the foot of today's Whitehall Street, as his official residence, but he desired a quiet place where he could reside well away from the contentions of New Amsterdam. He therefore called in his connections in the West India Company and arranged to purchase the Great Bowery. Previously leased by Director General Wouter van Twiller, the Great Bowery was the greatest of the bouweries laid out by the company along the old trail, running from about the present-day 5th Street to about 17th Street, lying between the Bowery and the East River. Much of the Great Bowery was salt marsh, but this didn't bother Stuyvesant, who was now the landlord of several tenant families and could set about building a manor house suitable to his dignity and status. It took another Indian war to fix Peter Stuyvesant's stamp on the Bowery. The still adventurous and aggressive Stuyvesant had just launched an expedition to take over the Swedish colony on Delaware Bay when trouble erupted over some stolen peaches. A war party from up the Hudson was passing through Manhattan en route to attacking some Long Island tribes when one of their women helped herself to a few of the ripe peaches in an orchard belonging to Hendrik von Deck. Von Deck shot and killed the woman before he realized that he was facing an angry war party, and he quickly fled for his life. To the Native Americans, European notions of property ownership were bizarre enough, but to shoot someone over a handful of peaches was just too much. The war party quickly changed its objective and swept down on the Dutch in Manhattan instead of the Indians of Long Island. They stormed their way into New Amsterdam, demanding the surrender of Von Deck, only to become inebriated with a timely gift of gin, and then hustled out by the Dutch garrison. That did not end the affair, however, and destructive raids on isolated farms began to blaze throughout New Netherlands, once again threatening to turn the Bowery Lane back into an Indian trail. A number of settlers along the Bowery were taken captive, among them the daughter of Wolfert Weber, the Bowery's first tavern keeper. Stuyvesant's wife, Judith, was as strong-willed as her husband. She remained at her Bowery mansion, fortifying the place as best she could and hiring 10 Frenchmen to defend it. Peter returned in haste from his triumph at New Sweden and managed to negotiate a peace with the belligerents. Not willing to take further chances with New Netherlands' security, he ordered that henceforth groups of at least 10 families would be assembled to form a village before any new farms would be authorized. The first of these villages would be formed on Stuyvesant's own Great Bowery. Stuyvesant Village joined a village of free Africans down the Bowery in the vicinity of Werpo Hill. Among them was Emmanuel de Groot, who had earned his notoriety in an interesting way. Known as the Giant, de Groot arrived in New Amsterdam as an enslaved African. In 1641, he was one of 7 slaves involved in a brawl in which Jan Primero, another slave, was stabbed to death. Exactly who stabbed Primero could not be established, so the 7 slaves were all equally convicted of the crime. But as the magistrates were unwilling to waste company property, lots were drawn for just one of the 7 to be hanged for the crime, and the lot fell to de Groot. Seeing the size of the man, the hangman didn't want to take any chances with the Giant, so he took the unusual step of tying 2 ropes with 2 separate nooses around de Groot's neck. In spite of all these precautions, de Groot survived the hanging when both ropes broke and dropped him, still alive, to the ground. The assembled crowd, seeing God's providence in this strange event, clamored for de Groot's pardon, and he was spared further attempts at execution. This miraculous escape from death enhanced de Groot's standing as a community leader, and in 1644 he found himself in charge of a small band of middle-aged and elderly slaves, freed by order of Director Kieft and left to settle where they could beyond the town boundary. They were free, but their children were to remain enslaved, an arrangement that benefited the bottom line of the Dutch West India Company, which thereby rid itself of responsibility for taking care of the aging slaves while retaining the services of their offspring. With their children still enslaved and the Indian War still raging, the little band decided to stay close to town. They moved onto the lands of the old Native American village along Werpo Hill, thus creating Manhattan's first African neighborhood just across the pond from the Bowery. Although de Groot's little village would eventually disperse, a significant African presence along the lower Bowery would persist into the early 1800s. 11 years later, at the close of the 1655 war, Stuyvesant's Bowery village began to take shape northeast of Werpo Hill. Stuyvesant's authoritarian nature liked his tenants neatly assembled into a compact settlement, and as things quieted down after the end of the Peach War, he set about turning the place into a functioning village. Apart from providing security, the village would be a pleasing complement to his country seat, where at last he could rule in peace a good hour's walk away from the rowdy natives of New Amsterdam. Religion ranked high on the list of Stuyvesant's priorities, and he built a stone chapel to join his manor house as the centerpiece of his Bowery village, bringing in a dominie every Sunday to conduct Dutch Reformed services. Keeping his distance from New Amsterdam and its ever-contentious burghers, Stuyvesant paid the expenses for a minister to commute from Brooklyn, instead, and provided an escort of soldiers to conduct him safely from his landing on the East River. All this cost Stuyvesant the pretty sum of 250 guilders a year, but it saved him the trouble of attending services in New Amsterdam, whose own church building never seemed to get finished. Stuyvesant's chapel, later rebuilt into the Church of Old St. Mark's in the Bowery, was the beginning of what today is the oldest currently used site of worship in New York. This distinction is both a memorial to Stuyvesant's rule and to his hardline religious policy. Despite the Dutch traditions of granting tolerant refuge to various refugee groups, the Calvinist Dutch Reformed Church was, from the beginning, planned to be the only established denomination in the colony. In the early years of New Amsterdam, this did not pose a problem, for apart from the ever-uncompleted edifice of the Dutch Reformed Church, none of the other denominations had succeeded in erecting a church building of their own, and that was the way Stuyvesant intended to keep it. He would have liked to have banned all competing denominations outright, but that was impractical even for him. So instead, he issued a decree in 1656 stating that other Protestant denominations were free to worship as they pleased, but only within private homes. Dutch Reformed churches would be the only religious buildings permitted in New Amsterdam, and Stuyvesant's chapel would stand as an enduring sign of his devotion. Along with the chapel, Stuyvesant provided other amenities of village life, namely a blacksmith shop and an inn. He set the streets of Stuyvesant Village to follow an orderly gridiron pattern, in contrast to the anarchic sprawl of New Amsterdam, with the streets named for himself and members of his family. His intentions would be honored as Stuyvesant Village grew. Running due north-south, Judith, Elias, and Margaret streets would eventually be crossed at right angles by Gerard, Governor, Peter, Stuyvesant, and Nicholas Williams streets. His chapel and mansion lay on Stuyvesant Street. As all these streets lay at a 45-degree angle to the streets that would be decreed in 1811, all but one would be eventually obliterated. Today, Stuyvesant Street, angling off from 3rd Avenue, remains the only trace of Stuyvesant's Bowery village. Peter Stuyvesant's unflinching commitment to his church would spark further controversies in his later years as Director General. The graveyard of Sheriff Israel on today's St. James Place, formerly the New Bowery, is a monument to one of these controversies. The colony's first Jewish congregation arrived in September 1654 in the persons of 23 refugees. Descendants of Sephardic Jews who had fled Iberia generations before, they had been living as colonists in Pernambuco, the capital of Dutch Brazil. In 1654, the Portuguese captured Pernambuco, and the Sevardum had to flee again. They sailed for Holland, only to fall prey to a Spanish pirate ship, which then set sail for Spain, Portugal's fellow land of the Inquisition. The Spanish ship, though, was overtaken by a French privateer, whose captain offered to convey the refugees to New Amsterdam at a stiff price. To raise the money, they had to sell off all their goods.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?